People are struggling to make ends meet as they are today. A majority of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. A majority of Americans have less than $1,000 of savings. 63% of Americans can't afford a $500 car repair. In this kind of environment, to attack our freedom would be devastating for our economy.
Now, much chatter was started when GOP presidential hopeful Ben Carson announced his tax plan based on Bible teachings that would have every American fork over 1/10 of their income to the government. The ballyhooed flat tax was almost immediately shot down and laughed at by a wide number of experts when the math involved showing his idea could put Americans into a $1 trillion plus hole. So it really leaves one to wonder if any of these candidates on either side have a realistic clue about the issue of taxes and how to dig America out of the mess we allowed past leaders to create for us. Let's welcome in for the first time best-selling author and small business expert with the SBE Council, the organization dedicated to protecting those all-important small businesses. Susan Solovic joins us here in the studio. Susan, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure
to meet you. I've got in front of me now, I have got tax plans coming out my ears telling me that this one's good for small business, this one's good for the wealthy, this one's good for parents. But when you look at them, does anybody really understand what they're talking about?
You know, it's really scary when you talk about the numbers. They don't add up, and it's definitely going to bring in less revenue. I don't care which plan in the GOP candidates you would choose, although Carly really hasn't come out with her plan yet. I'd be interested to see what, as the former CEO of HP, what kind of a plan she would come out with, because I would think of any of the candidates, she has to understand the numbers and the mathematics involved here and the financials. But I think generally anything is better than what we have now. And I do like the concept of a flat tax. I think Donald Trump's ability to lower the corporate tax rate to 15% is very smart. It's good for business. It's good for small businesses. But really what people don't understand when it comes to tax reform, and I was very sad to see that it was so late in the debate yesterday, by the way.
It really got buried.
Yeah, it did get buried, but I was glad that it did get brought up. They didn't really talk about regulation, which is stifling small business startups in this country. But I think that if you look at the tax plan that Donald Trump has put forward, it makes good economic sense. The problem, what people don't realize, is most small businesses are pass-through entities. So when you talk about tax reform, and you talk about corporate tax reform, that's great, lowering the corporate tax rate, but you've got to lower the tax rate on everybody, because those pass-through entities are getting taxed at their own employment or their own personal income tax rate. So, and they're putting that money back into their business. You've got to give them that flexibility to do that.
Isn't all part of this, though, when we start talking about tax plans, you can have a wonderful plan. What actually will pass?
Right.
What will get through? Because we still have this little thing called Congress that occasionally is sitting there. So as you look at all these plans, do any of them strike you and say, yeah, this one has a good chance of actually getting through the mess?
You know, I honestly, as long as things stay as they are, the biggest thing right now in 2016, small businesses are hoping for the status quo. That is the best thing that can happen to us right now.
But that's not going to happen, though, right?
Well, you know, no, President Obama thinks he's king, so he just, you know, writes whatever he wants, right? But I think that the issue of polarization in Congress right now is horrible. It is stagnating this economy. We used to be one of the leaders when it came to entrepreneurship. We're now ranked 12th in terms of all the developed countries in terms of entrepreneurship. And for the first time since the Census Bureau has been tracking it, the number of small business startups is below the number of closures. Where do jobs come from, Ed? Here's my point, and I wish that Janet Yellen, I hope she's watching right now, I'm sure she watches you all the time, but I want her to realize until you turn that trend around, this economy is going to grow at a tepid rate at best. It's a serious economic indicator that nobody looks at. You know, we're looking at the corporates sitting on cash. We're looking at what's happening with crude oil. We're looking at the stock market. But what is happening with small businesses? The labor participation rate is the lowest in 40 years. Imagine if you could give those people the incentive to go out and become their own boss, to create jobs and get this economy going and growing again.
Now, you just mentioned crude oil, so let's go there. Right. People are talking about what happened to the stock market today, another cratering. I'll wait for that for a moment here. And they're also talking about the Iranians now pushing a huge glut of oil onto the market. This is very tough to get to the consumers because Joe Beercan and Jane Beercan out there are looking at their gas bills and they're going, hey, look, $1.20 in gasoline. I'm loving this. Is that necessarily, though, a good thing for the overall economy?
It isn't, and you're right. You know, they're sitting there watching their Netflix movies or whatever, popping a beer, and what they don't understand is this is eventually going to cause the bottom to fall out of our economy.
How? Explain it to them quickly.
Well, all right, so you're going to lose jobs because big oil companies are not going to be able to maintain. They're already pulling back on capital investments and growth. So there are going to be a lot of geographic areas that are going to be hit hard if crude oil stays at this level, and probably a lot of closures of the smaller refineries, things like that, and that all means jobs. And you know what? That low dollar price at the gas pump, we're not seeing that translated into expenditures. You know, consumer sales, you know, people don't have
They're saving a
the
lot of money
confidence.
there, but they're not actually spending
Right,
that
they're
money
not
out
spending-
anyplace else
and if
because
you-
we had a horrible fourth quarter last year.
We had a horrible fourth quarter. Look what's happening now here in the first quarter. We know there's this is a wageless growth right now in this economy. So how can you have a recovering economy when you don't have wage growth? And you know, the last jobs report that came out, that 300,000 jobs basically were created, and yeah, the unemployment
Which
rate
is kind of a
is
fudgy
low.
number to begin with as well.
My mother always used to say, figures lie and liars figure, and boy, oh boy, is that a good example of that.
I think they're coming out to about 11,000 actual jobs by the time the Obama administration's numbers are checked.
Right.
20 seconds left. The cratering of Wall Street and the stock market, should people really be concerned, or is this a correction?
Well, it is a correction, I think, and my theory is, because I'm a long-term investor, you never panic. You know, it's always going to turn around. It's always going to be okay. Leave your money where it is. Don't run to your broker and say, sell, sell, sell. You know, it will come back, but I do think it's indicative of the fact that this economy is not where the president would like to sell us his bill of goods.
Well, that's just because it's a bill of goods.
That's right.
We got to wait until he moves out. Then we'll...
I think he keeps thinking if he says it enough, we're going to finally believe it, you know?
Isn't that the way of some presidents? Don't they do that? I say it long enough, they'll believe me.
That's right.
Listen, let's believe you instead. Susan,
All right.
thank you so much
Thank
for coming
you,
in. Let's do
My
it again.
pleasure.
We appreciate you
Oh,
being here.
great.
Susan
Wonderful.
Solovic. We'll
Thanks.
see you again. All right. Speaking of digging out every dime possible out of the taxpayers, Neil once again to the NFL. The sports professor is next.